understanding the inner workings of international trade. Massive amounts of cargo are transported throughout the world every day via a network of ships, trucks, and airplanes. Your t-shirt may be from Bangladesh, but your car may be from South Korea. All nations export, trade goods and services internationally, and purchase goods and services from other trading partners. They are either manufactured goods or agricultural products. All intangible items, such as advertising and telecommunication, are considered services, which are a dynamic and expanding segment of trade. However, there are more buyers and sellers in the trading network. Long supply chains enable products to be sourced, produced, packaged, and sold in various regions of the world through the complex web of global trade. Your phone, your shoes, the tuna fish you ate for lunch, and other items may have been made of materials that were created in one nation, processed in another, put together in a different nation, then packaged in another nation. How does this make sense? All before you arrive to the store. Why aren't nations just able to produce their own tuna, shoes, and phones, and increase the number of employment available in domestic industry? Prior to the 19th century, the majority of European nations attempted to prioritize self-sufficiency in a system known as mercantilism. Mercantilism sought to boost the nation's gold supply while minimizing imports and maximizing exports, as a means of both discouraging and profiting from the importation of commodities from abroad. This system gave rise to rigorous tariffs, or levies on imports. International trade was hampered by mercantilism. Nations strive to generate as much as they can on their own, including inefficiently produced items. These long-held notions were disproved in the late 18th century by so-called classical economists, who promoted the idea that societies should trade with one another in order to succeed due to comparative advantage. The notion that when nations concentrate on producing goods, they are relatively competent at importing, and everyone wins. This is referred to as specialization. And when nations don't have to invest time and money in making textiles or wine, for instance, there is more room for them to innovate and develop completely new products. These traditional economists contended that gauging a nation's strength by the amount of gold it could acquire was futile. These days, productivity, the capacity of an economy to make the most of its scarce resources, is how we gauge a nation's economic performance. The total of all the finished goods and services that a nation generates in a year is known as the gross domestic product, or GDP. The amount of human, physical, technological, and financial resources in a country determines how effectively and profitably that country can create certain things. While Germany exports millions of cars and computers, Costa Rica excels in exporting pineapples and coffee. The adoption of these novel notions. Trade between nations grew rapidly. Measuring GDP rather than just gold encouraged commerce and expanded economies. At the same time, technological and transit advancements greatly increased accessibility to distant markets. Global manufacturers and millions of new customers were connected by enormous container ships, freight planes, and inexpensive, immediate communication. After World War II, the newly established United Nations also produced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or Acquire This Agreement, which significantly reduced trade restrictions like tariffs and established guidelines for how nations should engage in unrestricted trade. In an effort to stay up with the rapidly evolving global economy, the GATT, which later changed its name to the World Trade Organization, strove to remove more barriers. The World Trade Organization broadened the scope of trade to encompass not only goods but also services. And it established laws governing intellectual property, such as copyrights and patents. Countries can negotiate the rules and regulations governing international commerce at the WTO and file complaints if they feel such rules are not being upheld. According to the principle of comparative advantage, if one country is unable to sell a high-quality product at a reasonable price point, or if new technology renders the firm uncompetitive, the country will fail. Jobs will be lost if its factories or stores are forced to close. Then, the economy of that nation must be modified to center around a competitive advantage. This is how trading on a global scale operates. The World Trade Organization, or WTO, is attempting to intervene in this situation since some nations and companies are allegedly breaking the laws of international trade. Labor unions claim, for instance, that the WTO is not protecting Chinese unfair trade practices from undermining American wages. Furthermore, some developing nations claim that the WTO regulations do not take into account their particular circumstances. For instance, the provision of agricultural subsidies by wealthier governments makes it difficult for farmers in smaller or poorer nations to profitably export their crops to those nations. These issues have not been resolved by the WTO. They are particularly challenging to handle because modifications to the regulations require agreement among all 164 WTO members. To handle their unique needs in trading strategy, some nations create bilateral and regional trade agreements. NAFTA, also known as the North American Free Trade Agreement, was established in 1994, with the goal of facilitating more trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. NAFTA served as a model for accords of this nature between other nations. World trade volume surged more than five-fold from 3.5 trillion to 19 trillion from just 1990 to 2015. More people than ever have access to more affordable and superior goods and services thanks to international trade's creation of a highly integrated global economy. It has boosted international ties and produced millions of new employment, contributing to world stability. Trade can also be detrimental to those people, businesses, and communities where imports make it difficult for local businesses to compete with better or more affordable items coming from the outside. Trade is an inevitable part of modern life, and it always produces winners and losers. Therefore, the task for policymakers is to provide help and training for new employment to those who have been disadvantaged so that everyone can continue to profit from the system that has offered consumers more options and more work for producers in every region of the world.